Welcome, welcome, welcome. Discussions happening on Discourse Friday. This first topic that we're going to be talking about is one that's been ravaging the nation. I'm going to talk about Atlanta and what happened there. What led up to it, the aftermath that we're seeing, and the pain that is existing across this nation and across the world with this. These victims died for what? Think about where they died, right? They're at a massage parlor. They're getting massages. They're working. They're at work. They're enjoying their day off or planning this day of relaxation. Then you have a gentleman come in and decide to end their lives. 3 separate locations, right? My apologies if I butcher their names. Young A.U., 63. Zhao Jie Tan, 49. Soonja Kim, 69. Soon Jung Pak, 74. Paul Andre Michaels, 54. Hyung Jung Grant, 51. Sorry about that. Connection's a little spotty. Hyung Jung Grant, 51. Delaney Ashley Wan, 33. And Dayu Feng, 44. 6 of whom were Asian Americans. For a year now, I guess over a year at this point, we've had people saying Kung Flu. We've had people saying China virus. And there's nothing wrong with saying China virus. That type of talk from leadership is unacceptable. Because then we see, if we follow the lines, you see where it leads to, right? In the United States, a place founded by immigrants, right? After kicking people who are already here out, who are still here, we have this uprise of trauma and this uprise of hate against the other. And this is not something new, right? Think about the Chinese Exclusion Act back in the early 1900s. Think about the internment camps in the 1940s. One of the biggest takeaways that I see in this incident is you have the guy claiming it's not a hate crime, that it was because of sex addiction. Then why kill all these elderly people? The youngest person killed was 33, and she was a newlywed, married for not even like a year, right? And her husband, think about this. Her husband was in another room. And if you take a class that is becoming very popular nowadays when it comes to mass shootings, because we have them so often, they tell you to do one of 3 things: run, hide, or fight, right? You hear these shots and you're in a room, in a building. You don't know where it's coming from, but it's not where you are. What he did was hide. He did one of the 3 things. And the thoughts that were going through his head is my wife okay? Is my wife okay? Is my wife okay? Then you have the Police officers finally show up, and out of everyone there, they put him in handcuffs. He asks about his wife. They refuse to tell him. He asks about his wife. They refuse to tell him. It wasn't until hours later they told him his wife is dead. Think about when an accident happens, right? In movies, we see it all the time. Are you family? Are you a relative? If you say yes, they let you through. They answer your questions. Yes, come identify the body, do all this other stuff. They left him in handcuffs for hours. And he's asking about his wife who was inside. He was asking about it. And it turns out she was one of the 8 victims. That in itself is a whole issue, right? And even he himself has told reporters, and you could read like the articles now when he's talking about it, he feels like the only reason that happened to him is because he's Latino. So they thought, like, what, did they think he was a suspect? You have 3 incidents of shootings happening in Atlanta, and yet you have somebody who's inside. You handcuff them. For what? Right? Oh, it's procedure. Then handcuff everybody. If I don't want to hear this procedure talk, I don't want to hear all this other stuff, because the reality is, if it's protocol, then it needs to be standardized. There's an SOP, the standard operating procedure. This should happen the same way every single time. But it doesn't. It doesn't. Oh, but each situation is different. That's why you have so many SOPs and so much litigation. That's what happens in government. Because of situations like this. That's why these things exist. And imagine that scenario. You decide to take your wife out and let's go get massages. Let's take the day off, right? Let's take a day to ourselves. The kids are babysat, we're fine. Just you and me, let's go have a relaxing day. And then this happens. And let's think about the other victims, right? Imagine you go to work and then this just happens. Or you're going for a massage and this happens because somebody's having a bad day. I'm sorry if I'm touching my face a lot, but I'm trying to keep my composure because this stuff is deep. And every week we'll be talking about various topics, even revisiting topics. And I invite you to join in on the live or comment below and have a discourse. Talk about this stuff. Invite into the safe place to be heard or to just speak and be listened to. You have these 8 victims. And the one thing I keep thinking about in the context of him saying it was a sex addiction or whatever, how quickly that became the story, right? Not only was the shooter who went to 3 separate locations and killed people, not only were they able to go to 3 separate locations, right? You'd think 911 got called at each site, and they didn't catch him until he made it all the way, like, practically to Florida, right? So now it's across state lines. So isn't that not a federal case now, right? But you have this pain reciprocating in the community. Because not only was he able to kill these people, he was able to get away. 3 times. Went to one location and killed people. Went to another location and killed people. Went to the last location and killed people, and then left the state. And was brought in alive. How many times in this country have we seen people just playing in a park or complying and are killed, who are unarmed, who did not kill anyone, right? Sorry. It's painful to understand this reality. And I ask, how can we change it? How can we create a better environment where this stuff doesn't happen? And we think back to, is because of sex addiction, right? Why was this, beyond the fact of targeting against women, right? Specifying or fixating on Asian women, going to massage parlors, right? Do these things exist? Yeah. Were these locations them? I don't know. I'm not going to say they were, they weren't. But why do we push that ideology, right? I know, like, after the Vietnam War, there's a lot of talks and discussions of soldiers going out there like, oh, my Asian wife and all that other stuff, or my Asian girlfriend, and reminiscing on that. And those things are created and recreated in movies, in TV shows, Love You Long Time, all that stuff, all those jokes, right? And we see how they have an effect. We see how it can transcend what we see. It could transcend the realities and the falsehoods that we see on the screens. And then the officer had the audacity to say he had a bad day. Why? Why were those the words that came to mind in discussing what happened? Why? Why those terms? Because we have to understand, like, our words carry strength, carry meaning, carry volume, right? And I know, like, from experience, working with youth or working with the public, you have to choose your words wisely. And there's oftentimes even doing this, and I think the hard thing with doing it live is I don't get to rewatch what I say and edit it, is basically just being in the moment, right? But contemplating what you are saying, contemplating how you are saying it, contemplating what the meaning behind your words can have. And those are things that you think about and consider when you're in a position of power, when you're in a leadership position, because your words have greater meaning than the average Joe Schmo, right? Because people are going to listen to you. The media is there listening and recording and understanding what you're saying. So if you say someone's had a bad day, you're kidding me, right? Because a lot of us have bad days. Some of us have bad months, bad years, right? We all experienced 2020, and that was rough on everyone, you know? For all of last year, we had so much pain and anguish that was happening, and a lot of us had very bad days. But not many of us went off and killed people. So for you to use those terms, you have to understand and take responsibility for that. And, you know, kudos that he's no longer talking on the situation. But how come someone like that, with that training, with that authority, was able to get into a position to say something like that? And where's their apology to the community, to the global community at this point, right? And it's so hurtful to think about and see how someone's words can ripple, right? With social media, with videos, with recording, with the way technology is today, everything's out in the public, right? Privacy is diminishing. So everything we do and say can carry volume, which is why even in high school, people are like, cautious what you put online, cautious what you make your email, right? Because you're going to be perceived in a certain way because of all this stuff. So that when you get into a position of power, you don't diminish the pain people are going through with words like that. These 8 victims, 6 of whom were Asian, or are Asian. It's incredible that the story is becoming the guy was a sex addict, right? The youngest person was 33 years old, right? So not only was he like having a fetish reality with the Asians, also old people. Like, you connect the dots. That doesn't make sense in the commonality of it all. Maybe it's true. Who knows? You know, this guy's not being interviewed. He's alive, so we can ask him, or someone can ask him. But why, right? Why is it okay for him to go to 3 separate locations to kill people and then leave the state and get captured way later, right? And as a common theme you see, because even when you think about the Oklahoma bombing back in the early 90s, they captured him miles away from when it happened and where it happened, taken him alive. You have all these incidences of a common theme where people are taken alive after they cause so much pain. And then the leadership immediately fumbles on the response. It was a bad day. You kidding me? You have this opportunity to take leadership, to take ownership, to provide justice, right? To protect and serve. You failed both. And it hurts. And what's done is done. And how do we move forward, right? How do we move forward from this position where you have an officer claim bad day and then go from there, right? I remember, if you're watching this, feel free to comment, or if you want to join in and share your thoughts on it. I'm fine with rambling. I'd rather not. But this is a hard topic to think about, you know? You have leagues of people in this country who are feeling pain, who are feeling attacked, who have been attacked, who have been called names, who have been hurt, and it built into the situation, right? So let's dive back. Let's go back a year. The President of the United States at the time was pushing this anti-immigrant agenda and this anti-Asian agenda, anti-China agenda. And as painful as it is as a Latino, when everyone's called Mexican, it's a similar context and communication that happens in the Asian community when everyone's called Chinese, right? Because they're not. They're Koreans, Vietnamese, Bangladesh, India, Japanese, Asia, right? It's a continent of various cultures and various peoples. And in this country, consistently stigmatized and racially attacked. In media, in comedy, in movies, and TV shows, games, books, studies, and even by the president. We see this rise of anti-Asian essence and these hate crimes over the last year, right? We're hearing of people getting attacked, people getting stabbed, people getting beaten, people getting spit on, people getting yelled at. In all places too. It's not even like a partisan issue. It's both sides, right? Because this stuff is happening in New York, this stuff is happening in Atlanta, this stuff is happening in California, this stuff is happening in Kansas or wherever. It's happening everywhere. And now we have 8 people gone from this world. And think about where they were, at a massage parlor. To have a day of relaxation or work there. And to be gunned down. I think the hard thing for me, because I know for me especially, I've studied history, and I'm huge into like the national parks. And one of the parks I visited about 2 years ago now at this point, or I guess a year and a half or whatever you want to say, was Minidoka in Idaho. Yes, Idaho, the state of Idaho. I went up to this spot called Minidoka National Historic Site. Now, Minidoka, many don't know this, because the name doesn't sound ultimately familiar, was a concentration camp. Was an internment camp, right? Was an internment camp, sorry for that. It was an internment camp where Japanese Americans and Asian Americans were held during World War II. And there were several of them. You have Manzanar, you have, I'm blanking on the other names. But Minidoka is the one I went to. And again, foolish me. I went to the site, it's a national park, so let me go check it out. And when I went there, I didn't know the story. I got there and I wanted to see what's this place about. So I go to Idaho. I went to Hagerman Fossil Beds. Like, ooh, fossils, geology, cool. And I go to Minidoka. And I get to Minidoka, and it's about the Japanese internment, right? How the United States persecuted and captured and housed thousands of Japanese Americans because we were at war with Japan. Why didn't we do the same with Germans? Why didn't we do the same with Italians? Why don't we do the same with Russians, right? You have this racist sentiment attached to this. And it's etched in law. It's etched in planning. It's etched in the deeper confines of this country. And if you get a chance, I'd highly recommend listening to Fort Minor, a song called Kenji. And in it, it talks about that situation of how people were held in concentration camps, of how even after that was over, and these Americans, the people who came here illegally, because that's like the big thing nowadays, right? And people who started businesses, who had homes, when the stuff was over and they went back home after that trauma, their businesses were burnt down. Their houses were attacked. They were still attacked. That racist sentiment was still alive at the end of the 1940s, right? Which bleeds into the 50s. And then you have these children being raised to be anti-Asian, to be anti-Japanese, anti-Chinese. Then you have the rise of China. You have this president from before saying anti-Asian things, anti-China things, linking them of other, right? When these people are Americans, when these people are here, they're natural immigrants, legal immigrants, if that's the term you want to use. The point is they're here in this country, and more importantly, they're human beings. And you have the sentiment that builds and builds and builds. The sentiment builds and can create this, what we saw in Atlanta. This sentiment builds and happens what we see across this country, where people are getting attacked. I know there's a lot of memes and pictures and celebration about that woman who fought back, right? Why should she have to? That shouldn't have happened in the first place. And there's often the excuses, oh, the person was mentally ill, oh, the person was having a bad day, oh, the person was a sex addict. No, these things are wrong. Where is the protection? Where is the protection for people in this country to be safe in their communities? Especially in these communities of ethnic origins, right? It's painful to witness. It's collectively traumatic. It is hard because we see it happen so much and so often. And it's painful to comprehend and even more painful to talk about. I invite you to have these conversations to talk about how these situations made you feel. Like, how did this make you feel? How did hearing about these people getting shot and killed make you feel? How do you talk about this with your friends, with your family, with your loved ones? If you have children, how do you talk about this with your children? If you work with children, how do you bring this up? Is it your job? Because at the end of the day, we're all connected now. With the internet, with media, with news, the way it is, it's all happening so fast. And when I came on here last week, I planned to talk about this topic, hashtag Stop Asian Hate, right? I plan to talk about this because it's a powerful and uncomfortable issue. And within the same week, we have another shooting in Colorado. We have another incident where someone's having a bad day. What is causing this to happen? What is causing people to go off and shoot people? Oh, they're crazy. Oh, they're this. Excuses to a degree, right? Because in this country, we have the opportunity to create change, but do we? We have the opportunity to have conversations, but do we, right? And I invite you to have these conversations. You can have them here, you can have them with me, offline, online, whenever. But don't be afraid to use your voice, right? We all have something to contribute since we're here. And most importantly, we all have the power to diffuse these situations. When you hear these racist sentiment, oh, we love you long time, cut that shit out. You can tell them that's not funny. Like, oh, well, you have an attitude. It's not funny. If it's not funny, it's not funny. If it was funny once, that's fine, but we grow, right? Think about Breakfast with Tiffany's, right? That was, that scene. At the moment, win an Oscar. Today, not happening, right? Because as a society, we have to grow. And I know a lot of this can be piled into the whole concept of cancel culture. They try to cancel South Park, so stop with that whole meme about the generation who grew up on The Simpsons and South Park turned out like this. They try to cancel South Park. They try to cancel The Simpsons. They try to cancel all this stuff, right? And now that same side is saying, don't take away our guns. Look past the taglines and the headlines and all this other crap and look at the root causes, right? And I know I'm jumping around a bunch, but in the context of the Asian Americans, dial it back to the early 1800s. People who built the railroads, threw them into the mountains with dynamite, didn't care about their lives, and boom, now we have an economy. Then you move forward to ban them, Chinese Exclusion Acts. Then you move forward, internment camps. Then you move forward, now they're communists, Vietnam War, Korean War, right? We're always attacking and bombing and all this stuff. For what? We never say sorry. We never truly move forward. And yet they still come to this country, right? Because we're the greatest country on earth. How great are we that we can't solve the same issue that's been happening for decades? How great is it that this pain and trauma just becomes more collective and more traumatic and more compiled with no solutions in sight? Within the same day that these shootings happened, you have Republicans and these other gun lobbyists and all these other stuff say no gun laws. Why not? If the person can't get that style of gun, it could help reduce the chances, right? And that's a whole different topic, right? Because then you have people like, oh, it's our Second Amendment right. Look up what the Chief Justice back in the 90s said about that in his review of the Second Amendment. Notice how short the Second Amendment is. It doesn't make sense. You think they could have envisioned a machine gun? They barely had single fire rifles. And think about it, that was back when you had wolves and bears and elk and all this other animals living in your backyard, because this was an open country, right? Wasn't all built up the way it is today with all the pollution and buildings and extinction of animals. And I'm not saying take all the guns away. You know, I'm not saying that. But insure them. And notice how car accidents were happening and now we have seatbelts. Why do we have seatbelts? Why do we have car insurance? Why do we have to have car insurance? Why do you get a ticket if you don't have car insurance? Because we adapt. We create these new things. Yeah, they act as if these laws are set in stone. They're not. And that's the thing. That's the amazing thing. Like, oh, the founders thought this. The founders never thought black people could vote. The founders didn't think black people were people. The founders owned slaves. So we can't take their word for, like, that's the law of the land. They built it in a way that it can change. And it's interesting enough, even if you go back into that context historically, because even with Washington's era, Jefferson, they all saw the slavery issue being a thing. And what did they do? They made it a law after the Three-Fifth Compromise. They pushed it that it cannot even be discussed until the 1820s or the 1830s, whatever it was. They all died by the 1800s. By the 1810s, they're all gone. So all those founders, poof, dead because they're old. Then you fast forward to when it could happen again and they could talk about it. Civil War. Right? These laws can change for a reason because we change. Technology changes. The world changes. We as a country changes. If you want to be like specific too, what if gun laws only applied, like the first 10 amendments, what if we say they only apply to the original 13 colonies? What if we say they only apply to muskets? We've changed so much as a society that we have to look at things differently. Like right now, there's debates in Congress and ideas floating around of how to regulate social media, how to regulate elections. Georgia today, or yesterday, this past day or two, just passed a law that you can't even give people standing in line to vote water. Now that's a crime. To give people water is a crime. Where does it say that in the original Constitution? Do you think the founders thought about that? So we keep having this pain and this hate that happens continually. Yet how do we move forward? And now we often ask in these situations for those communities to speak up. Not for nothing. These communities are in pain. These communities are traumatized. These communities are attacked. How about you solve something? How about you come up with a solution and then check with us? Bring something to the table instead of having us plan it out and do it for you. Right? And I did read this, I think I shared it on the story. I'm going to go through some of it sporadically, but give your body the space to feel. And I think that's one of the biggest things why I'm going to start doing this every week for Discourse Fridays. Here's a space to feel, to listen, to talk, to be heard, and to acknowledge the pain and let your emotions feel. I'm not an expert. I'm not a psychologist. I'm just a guy who studies history and looks at patterns and pay attention to the news and pay attention to our leaders and actively do my best to vote and be active. You know, not perfect. I will never claim to be. I'll never push that onto anyone. but there's a lot we can do together. First, we have to allow ourselves to feel, to acknowledge what just happened in this trauma. And every week I'm trying to stay onto one topic because there's so much happening. Like, again, probably at another time we'll focus more on the gun rights and things like that, because we just had another shooting in Colorado. And I think the last point I want to bring up to the context of the Colorado, what happened there, notice how in Atlanta he had a bad day, and in Colorado he was a Syrian immigrant. Why is that the focus? He's an American citizen. Done. You know what I mean? Like, but discussion for another time. Here we have a situation in which 8 people were killed in 3 separate locations. Here we have a situation where 6 of them were Asian Americans, were of Asian descent, under the claim of a sex addiction. Now let's dial back into the context of why that's even a thing, right? You have this notion that Asians are seen as like as sex symbols, right? Or as being sexualized. And we see it even, I remember, I think a couple weeks ago, or I guess a month or so ago at this point, I was watching Enter the Dragon. And you could see the scenes where over-sexualize Asian women, and women in general, right? And that's an issue that we as a society have portrayed, right? And we've pushed that agenda. You can even go back hundreds of years, or thousands of years, to the context of concubines, right? And that history and that idea floats around and becomes a stigma that gets associated with people of Asian descent. Me love you long time. All that crap, you know? Said in jokes, said in seriousness, it has an effect. Now, in that context, who do you hold accountable? Do we hold accountable Hollywood? Do we hold accountable freaking Genghis Khan? You know what I mean? Like, what do we do in that situation? Personally, I don't know. But what I do know, and anyone can feel free to share what they believe, I believe we can hold ourselves accountable. And I think I said this a little bit earlier. If you hear something like that, like, it's not funny. You know what I mean? Like, oh, they're just joking. And it builds until 8 people die. You know? One of the greatest teachers I ever had, his name was Dr. Dharm. And I regret having him at such a young age because he was a brilliant man and I wish I had him in college. But beyond that fact, he would often say, you can say and do whatever you want as long as you're willing to accept the consequences. What are the consequences? What are we willing to do to end this violence, to end these stigmas, to end this pain? Allowing things to slide, or allowing people to say these racist things. Oh, but they don't mean it. But it's racist. Oh, you're trying to cancel me. You're canceling yourself. Because you can't apologize and move forward and accept what you're saying, or accept that what you're saying is wrong, right? What are you truly doing? What are you doing in this situation that allows others to feel less than? And if your words or your actions make others feel less than, even if it doesn't happen immediately, take that into consideration, you know? We all make mistakes. We all say things we can regret. But we can't go back into the past and change them. We can only move forward. We can accept what happened. We can apologize. And we can move forward to make sure that these things don't happen again. That is growth, right? I know there's things in my life personally where I wish I could go back in time and go in a time machine and never say those things or never do those things or do things differently. But we can't. We can't do that. But now we have this history that built. Oh, I love you too. We have this thing that built from centuries of anti-Asian descent in this country, and now it's built into this, right? this pain and trauma that's being felt in Atlanta, and look how quickly that's being forgotten because something else happened in Colorado. Who knows what's going to happen today as I'm speaking, or even next week, or by the time this video gets posted on Facebook and YouTube, because FYI, it's going to take a while because my internet's not the best. But you have the power to better yourself and to keep in line those around you. Not to be confrontational, not to be showboaty and pointing fingers and stuff, because that's not always the best method, right? But you have to give your body that space to feel, to look back at the words you're saying, and to acknowledge the pain and let your emotions feel, right? Because we're all going through this trauma together, right? More so, in my opinion, in the Asian community, because we've had a rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans, against people of Asian descent in this country. Now, the next thing I want to talk about or state is like defining racial trauma. And this one I took straight off of the post I shared. It's about like 11 different posts to like read through about the situation. But racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress is psychological injury caused by encounters with racial bias and ethnic discrimination, racist attacks, threats of harm, and hate crimes. It can also be the result of the accumulations or small occurrences such as everyday discrimination or microaggressions. These things don't happen in one day. These things build. First you call it the China virus, then you call it the Kung flu, then you start seeing a rise in people of Asian descent get spit on, get called coronavirus. You have a teacher in New York City whose fifth graders, these are children, whose fifth grader called their teacher coronavirus. Or asked, do you have coronavirus? What kind of, you know what I mean? Like, what kind of crap is that? What are we teaching our children? And we often see this rhetoric of we care so much about the children. What are we showing them? What are we showing them when we say Kung flu? When we say, I'm going to stop saying that at this point. I'm sorry about that. But it's angering because these are the words in the dialogue that's been passed around. And my apologies if I offended anyone by saying that a couple times. But these are the words said by a president of the United States. These are the words said by senators, and Dave Chappelle put it best. Like, that should have been said by comedians, you know what I mean? People who do that for a living. As wrong as it is, it's, you know, it makes more sense being said there, but in the same context, should it be said at all, right? Another thing is, like, there's no one right way to feel, right? There's no way to feel righteous about this or understand what's happening or truly comprehend all this stuff, which is why I want to do this Discourse Fridays. So it can be said here or it can be said later, or you can have these discussions, because not having them leads to Atlanta. Not having them leads to Colorado. Not having them leads to what's going to happen next. It hurts to consistently see this pain and strife happen in this country, who claim to be the best country on earth, who claim to be the richest country in the world, who claim to be inclusive. But are we? Are we in the right when 8 people die and we do nothing about it? We do little to nothing about what caused this to happen, and we're not even attacking the symptoms. We're not even truly attacking any of that stuff. We're not changing our ways. We're not changing our rhetoric. We're not changing. And actually, you're seeing a whole different thing of people just doubling down. They're doubling down on what they think and what they feel, and oh, cancel culture this and cancel culture that, oh, coronavirus this, coronavirus that. Why? People are hurting right now, and we want to stay true to who we are. Who are we? Do we really see ourselves as the hero, or have we finally lived long enough to become the villain? We can correct action, but we can do it together. And it starts with a conversation. It starts with everyday actions we take personally. It starts with holding ourselves accountable and holding those we care about accountable, and then our community, and then expand from there. Holding our officials accountable, right? And mental health issues should not be criminalized, right? We finally are having a larger conversation of mental health, right? But my thing with sorry about that. My thing even with like mental health is how much trauma are we causing on the mental health of these communities of color, right? Think about the trauma that's felt across people of color. How Asian Americans are pushed as this ideal immigrant, right? Because their income on average is actually higher than white Americans, right? Or something like that, or close to it. The connotation that they gotta get straight A's, they're gonna be doctors and all this other stuff. Like, think about all those things that are said in comedies or said in TV shows or displayed in movies, and how that's finally coming to a change. But is it change? It's not a change that happens overnight, that's for sure. But think about the damage that happens in that context. Think about the actors and actresses who've straight up said, yeah, I'm tired of getting the same role. Think about that traumatic experience when you're trying to feed your family and create a living, and you're being told, can you say it again with an accent? And mental health is no joke, but think about the trauma we're causing and the mental health crisis we're causing to the youth and to the society, and the demonstration we're posing to the children whose parents or whose leaders are like, oh, this is not a concern, this is not an issue, or nothing happens because of it. And I will say, you notice how quiet All Lives Matter are right now? Or you notice how quiet Blue Lives Matter is right now? What are you saying? Because you're saying it with your silence. And every iteration of grief and pain are valid. We all suffer in different ways and react in different ways. We all go through traumas from childhoods that even things that happen today can affect you years from now, right? But every iteration of that grief and pain, it's valid. Don't discredit or invalidate what people are feeling, you know? And don't use your feelings to discredit others as well. So, again, I'll talk about cancel culture in another video. But think about what just happened to this community, to their families, and what's happening on the larger conversation. Because it's not happening. People aren't. They're not even having the opportunity to grieve, because these people have to be so strong and go on the news and talk about who their family was and talk about who their mother was and talk about who their grandmother was. Remember, these people between the ages of 33 and 74, right? Many of whom, let me think, I think it's about 3 of them. Oh no, 2 of them definitely could have been on Social Security, and 2 of them, yeah, for that, and 3 others were already in their 50s. They already lived 50 years. And let's dial back 50 years. Let's say the older one, 51, Young Grant, right? 51 years old. 50 years ago was what? They were in 2021, 2020. That's 1970, right? So you already had the assassination of Malcolm X, JFK, Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King Jr. All those people are already dead. You have this war in Vietnam and Korea happening in this person in his childhood. Think of all the things that that person went through. And then to be here in the United States, go to a massage parlor, and that happens. Think about the trauma that's happening, and they have to be so brave and strong to convince America that these were good people. Because that's another conversation that happens often, where you have to convince America that this person of color wasn't a criminal, wasn't a sex worker, wasn't a this, wasn't a that. You have to. And the mental health and pain and grief that you have to bear in that situation. And radical self-care and healing are important. Not only are we going through a pandemic, we're going through an entire change of things. With all this pain and all this grief, all this loss, over 500,000 people died because of just this pandemic. That's not even including the people who've died in these protests, not including people who've died in these acts of violence, or naturally, or these accidents that happen every year with driving and drugs and all the things that are happening in the world and in our country and in our communities. So we need leadership to step up, and we need to hold these leaders accountable, because we have that power. We have the power of our voice. We have the power of our communities, because we're stronger together. So start having these conversations. If not with people around you, have them with yourself. And here's perfectly fine to have a platform here to say what you want to say. I'm open and listening to any and all of you on this, or even after this. I'm not an expert. Don't claim to be that. But I think it's just important to have a space where these conversations can happen. Ideally with a professional, ideally with a psychiatrist and all that other stuff. But even in a space like this, and support Asian and Pacific Islander communities. We all have these communities and friends and family, and support can look in various things. Support could be money and financially if you have it. Support could be listening. Support could be checking in, like how are you doing? It doesn't have to be specified to this. It could just be the human thing to do, to check in with your friends. And I will say as well, respect the trauma. Because, like, I have a friend, I'm not going to say names, but I thought, like, hey, I'm doing this live tonight. Come on. I would love to hear your opinions and your thoughts. Why let them express their trauma and pain right now? If they see this, and they want to join and talk in the next one or comment on this one later, that's fine. That's their choice. That's their freedom. And at this point, they've watched pretty good into the video to get to this point. But understand, like, also, like, when these conversations are happening, oftentimes, and people of color have to exuberate their own trauma to express the realities of this, because one sect of the communities and the society doesn't believe these things happen. Yet we know these things happen. We know this pain. Confront internal biases and confront internalized biases about Asians, and educate yourself and others genuinely to reduce harm. Like I was saying earlier, check yourself, check others around you in a respectful way. Don't start drama. No need to start a battle, but hold people accountable for their words and actions. You know, like, oh, I said that 20 years ago. Well, you don't say that anymore. These are why we don't say these things anymore. Because we see the pain that they cause, right? It hurts to have these things happen, but it also hurts to live through them. And as we're growing, we don't always recognize the pain that we've went through as kids or as adults or in that moment. It could be months, years, decades later that it triggers something, and we have to respect that. And I get these jokes. You know, I've watched South Park. I grew up on that, the whole city walk, and comedy's comedy, but this is real life. We're not all comedians. We're not professionals. Gabriel Iglesias, professional. Um, Bernie Mac, professional, right? Ryan Davis, professional. Dave Chappelle, he had a great joke. I'm not going to repeat it because I'm not Dave Chappelle. But it hold these commentaries to light. You know what I mean? Like, look deeper in these jokes, because some of these comedians, they have some deep stuff that they talk about. But in our own lives, we have the power to confront these biases and combat them, right? And how to respond to racial trauma, because that's a huge issue, and we're seeing it across our nation and within our communities right now. And even ask the question, what is collective trauma? Right? Because we all went through this as Americans. On a different level, people are going through this as Asian Americans. On a different level, people are going through this differently as Asians. People are going through this differently who are from Atlanta. People are going through this differently who are from Korea or China or Japan or Bangladesh. But collectively, this all happened, and we all saw it. We all have our reactions to it, and we all have our thoughts on it. And that's the point of these Discourse Fridays, is simply to provide a space where these conversations can happen. And the ignorant stuff, you know, I'm gonna let's shut that down on the basis of history and context like that. But it's not easy. I guess like an example of collective trauma, and I actually wrote down these two examples, right, and how they're different. We all know the hashtag never forget, right, for 9/11, and not to discredit or plague anything against that, because that was a traumatic experience that we all went through in this country and even around the world. But you see how we all went through that moment. You can all think about if you were alive at that point, or a kid, or an adult, or had a loved one who was there. You can still remember where you were on 9/11. And that's a collective trauma. And another collective trauma, which I like to bring in distinction of why this collective trauma is slightly different, especially in the context of the Asian communities, is think about the collective trauma of Emmett Till. You have this young black boy from Chicago, 14 years old, who was lynched and killed, right? He's killed, and you have this spark of a flame that started the civil, or really lit the fuse for the civil rights movement to get moving. That is the collective trauma that everyone in this country and in the world went through. But black people went through it a little different. And I say little in the context that I was less than, but like, to bring the fact that it was different for them. And it's different for us even today. We all can signify these two events And we have people who are alive today who never experienced any of them live. But they are both collective trauma. These events are a shared experience that alter the narrative and the psyche of a group or community. Here we have another instance of collective trauma. Sorry. And this trauma of hypersexualization and how to cope, right? Think about the context of the story, right? You have this young white man with an AR-15 go to 3 massage parlors and shoot them up under the context that he's a sex addict. Think about the hypersexualization of Asian people, of Asian women, and of women. And I can't get over the fact that the youngest person is 33 years old, right? And I look at these pictures of these people who were killed, and I can't fathom what fantasy or what idea or what this person was thinking. Young A.U., Zongjig Tan, Sunza Kim, Sung Jung Park, Paul Andre Michaels, Hyung Jung Grant, Delana Ashley Yuan, Dao Yu Feng. Gone. Because of a sex addiction? I want to scream bullshit so bad. It doesn't make sense. And that's the story being perpetrated. That's the story being pushed. And where do we go from here? I invite you to talk about this with loved ones. I invite you to talk about this with your friends, with your family. I invite you to talk about this with your community. I invite you to hold your leaders accountable so that change can happen so that this does not happen again. We are stronger together. We are in this together. We can help make this not happen again because it doesn't need to happen. I invite you to come back here on this live every Friday, 8 o'clock Eastern Time for Discourse Fridays and have some discourse. Share your thoughts. Feel free to jump in the chat or join the live or anything like that, which is why I'm using this platform. And then even feel free to share this or whatever, because then I'll be saving it to YouTube and sharing it on Facebook as well. It will take a while because internet it's not the best, but have these conversations. My plan is to be here once a week and focusing on one topic at a time. And as hard as it is, because you see me jumping around even all these topics here, a lot of it's interconnected. A lot of it is not just one thing. You do have this build of anti-Asian emphasis that's been happening, especially this last year with coronavirus, especially because of President Trump, especially because of the Republican Party. And I'm going to call them out. And again, my opinion, but back it up with facts. Because we're seeing this pain and this trauma happen across the board. We're seeing this pain and trauma happen across the country, across the world. Is this the type of world we want to live in? Is this the world we want to leave our children? Talk about the world you want, and let's make that a reality. So until next week, signing off. See you next time for Discourse Fridays. Be safe, and if you want to talk more, I'm always open to it. You be safe now. May those people rest in peace, and may us move forward and create a world so this doesn't happen again. Take care.